One commonality in the idea of Buddhist right action in the Eightfold Path has to do with avoiding harm. This is something I discussed in a recent video on that topic. That is, the way when we read about right action, we read about various prohibitions, ways that we can avoid harming others by not killing, not stealing, not lying, not committing sexual misconduct. And then any generous actions we take, any positive actions that we do, seem to be, in this picture anyway, kind of like icing on the cake. They're not strictly ethically necessary, but they're just good to do as well as the ethically necessary prohibitions. At least that's the picture that we seem to get. However, having said that, one of my viewers responded talking about a potential duty to act that we might have. This viewer says, right action cannot only be avoidance, except for generous action being the icing on the cake. In emergency response, there's something called a duty to act that legally compels a responder to act if they're employed as such. There's also something called a moral and ethical duty to act. That is where there is no legal compulsion to act, but morally and ethically it's the right thing to do. Such action is not governed by one's job, but by Good Samaritan laws which protect someone who has training when acting out of a moral and ethical duty to act. This would be a case where right action was not an avoidance, but was the way to do no harm. Now this is, I think, a great point and a great question. There are various issues I'm going to leave aside here, in particular having to do with the distinction between laws and ethics. We can have a law that's unethical, we can have ethical things that are not laws, and so on. I'm just going to leave that kind of issue aside for now. That's not really essential here, and get to the basic question, which is whether we do find a duty to act like this, in particular in early Buddhism and the teachings of, at least as far as we know, the historical Buddha. Or to put it another way, if we can think of our practice as learning to be wiser and kinder and calmer, how do we really become kind? How do we best practice that kind of kindness? Is it simply through prohibitions, or are there things that we really ought to be thinking of doing in a positive sense? And I think when we look at the Buddha's answers here, we see another way that he is a pragmatic ethical thinker. To reiterate, when we look at the basic tenets of Buddhist ethics involving, let's say, right action and the 5 precepts, what we find are these kinds of prohibitions, which seem to arise because the Buddha, at least in his overt Dharma teachings, seems to have considered the eradication of dukkha, of suffering, to be the major point of ethics. And if the major point is to eradicate suffering, the surest and quickest route to that is to stop people from causing harm to one another. So that, I think, is the overarching, the more serious problem that the Buddha was looking at in his overt ethical teachings to his audiences. But there also were cases where the Buddha seems to have implied that action was morally necessary. One of these examples we find in the Vinaya, actually, which is the rule book for monastics. In there we read a story of a monk who was ill with dysentery. This monk seems to have been lying on the ground, untended by anybody. The Buddha was walking through, saw this monk, called to his attendant Ananda. The two of them then got this monk, washed him off, put him in clean robes, and put him in bed. At that point, the Buddha went and looked for this monastic's companions, the ones who were living with him in his kuti, in his hut, or at least nearby. And he asked them, why weren't they tending to him? And they said to him, essentially, because he doesn't do anything for us either. And at that, the Buddha replied, "Monks, you have no mother or father to nurse you. If you don't nurse one another, who will? Whoever would nurse me should nurse one who is sick." And at that point, the Buddha laid down a monastic rule that monastics had to care for one another when they were ill, and not to care for a monastic who was ill was considered an offense. That is what the Buddha laid down, this kind of rule. Another example from the early monastic Sangha relates to speech. In this case, Sariputta, the Buddha's right-hand disciple, the one who is considered preeminent in wisdom, was giving a talk before a group of monastics. And one of the monks in the audience didn't agree with something that Sariputta was saying and continually interrupted him, sort of harassing him during the talks, until eventually Sariputta had to stop talking. The Buddha heard this, noticed this, and berated Ananda, that is the Buddha's own the Buddha's own attendant, for not having intervened. He says, "Ananda, how can you just watch while a senior mendicant is being harassed? Don't you have any compassion for a senior mendicant who is being harassed?" In other words, Ananda, and I think by extension the other monastics who were sitting there in the audience, had a duty to speak up and stop this monk from harassing Sariputta. Similarly, when it comes to praise or criticism for another person, a kind of prohibitive ethics, we might say, might just simply tell us that neither praise nor criticism is ever really warranted. And this is in fact the argument that the wanderer Potalya had when talking with the Buddha. When the Buddha and Potalya were discussing this matter, Potalya said that the best person is the person who refrains from criticizing another and refrains from praising another, because, Potalya said, equanimity is best, and we can only keep that equanimity if we cease from praise and cease from criticism. But in this case, in this sutta, the Buddha actually disagreed with Potalya. The Buddha said that the best sort of person is one who criticizes those deserving of criticism at the right time, truthfully and correctly, and praises those deserving of praise at the right time, truthfully and correctly. In other words, what the Buddha is saying here is that we have a kind of a duty to praise and criticize somebody, obviously rightly, correctly, and also at the right time, and we might say the right place. It's not simply correct to praise and criticize willy-nilly at any time and any place, but to pick our time and place. That is what we are ethically compelled to do, at least according to the Buddha. The best sort of person will do this. There are another couple of suttas that involve cases of wealthy financiers who died without heir. And in their cases, the cases of both of these wealthy financiers, their fortunes, since they did not have heirs, ended up going into the royal coffers. And the Buddha felt that these cases were, to say, morally dubious. As the Buddha says, when a good person has acquired exceptional wealth, they make themselves happy and pleased, and they make their mother and father, partners and children, bondservants, workers and staff, and friends and colleagues happy and pleased. And they establish an uplifting religious donation for ascetics and Brahmins that's conducive to heaven, ripens in happiness, and leads to heaven. So what the Buddha is saying here is that the morally upright person is going to be generous with their wealth and spend it. Not only that, he goes on to suggest that not doing this is a sign of moral degeneracy. As he says, as cool water in an uninhabited region evaporates when not drunk, so too, when a scoundrel acquires wealth, they neither use it themselves nor give it away. But when a wise person gets hold of wealth, they enjoy it and do their duty. That fine person, having supported the family, blameless, goes to a heavenly place. So what we have here is a case where the scoundrel, in the Buddha's words, hoards wealth and doesn't use it, whereas the wise person, the good person, uses wealth in beneficial ways by being generous. Now, is this to say that being a hoarder in this sense, being stingy, is morally wrong, we might say, creates bad karma? That's not entirely clear. What does seem clear from these passages, though, is that our use of wealth is an expression of the moral character of our minds, if you like, the moral purity of our minds. the person with a morally pure mind is naturally generous. The scoundrel, on the other hand, who is not morally pure, is somebody who neglects to be generous, therefore does not build up good karma, and therefore is not going to benefit from the good karma that they would have gained by being generous. It's not clear, however, that negative karma is created by being stingy. However, another sutta, a sutta that follows up on this one, which involves, again, the second financier, discusses a case that's sort of very interesting in this regard. In this case, the Buddha talks about a financier who is generous at one point, but then later regrets his generosity. He regrets having given money away to people who were in need. And in this case, the Buddha says that this financier in the future is going to find it difficult to enjoy pleasant experiences. In other words, it seems from this second case as though this miser's regret has itself lain down bad karma and made it difficult for the person to then experience sense pleasures in a way that makes them happy. And this is, I think, a psychologically very interesting story. We can think of, for example, a miser being the sort of person who goes out and expends a lot of money on a good meal, but is not able to enjoy the meal because all they're thinking about is the amount of money that they've spent on it. This is an example of this kind of interrelation between that miserliness and the inability to be happy, which is a kind of an example of the fruition of bad karma. It's not a happy existence. So, what's the upshot here? Do we have a kind of a duty to act in early Buddhism? And I would argue from the cases I've just discussed that it seems as though we do have a duty to act in early Buddhism, according to the Buddha. Now, some of this may involve this distinction between laws and morality that I talked about at the very beginning of this video. In other words, some of these issues may have to do with the Vinaya, with the moral, or I should say the legal code, the code of rules involving monastics, such that monastics should care for one another if they're sick. That's a monastic rule. But I think in the background is indeed an idea of that we do have certain kinds of moral duties. Not all of this has to do with monastics. Not all of this has to do with the Vinaya. This also, I think, does show us that ethics in early Buddhism isn't simply about prohibitions, about prohibiting harm from one another, although that perhaps is the most important thing, but that ethics also involves these kinds of duties to one another. Now, one duty I think that we do have to one another in a democracy is to vote. So I hope that you are registered and will go out and vote in the election if you are in the United States. As I'm making this video and as it's going to come out, our election is tomorrow. It is a very important election. If you want to hear more about these kinds of practices that we can do for social change in Buddhism, I did a video about that a while back, and I'll leave a link to it up here on the screen if you want to see it. If you're getting something out of these videos that I'm making, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on that next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.